June stood on the auction block while her own husband told the crowd she was broken goods because she couldn't give him an heir. He was ready to trade her for a pack of hunting dogs and a bag of grain just to get her out of his sight. The village elders laughed as they prepared to cast her out into the wolf-infested woods. But then, a black carriage pulled by horses with eyes like fire stopped the entire auction. A man stepped out, his presence so heavy that the air itself seemed to freeze. He didn't look at the fertile younger girls or the bags of gold. He walked straight to June, knelt in the dirt, and placed a crown of black diamonds at her feet. He looked at her cruel husband and said, "You called her empty, but I see a woman who will carry the future of my entire kingdom." June lived in a village where a woman's only value was the children she could provide. She had been married to Miller for 3 years, and every month that passed without a pregnancy made him more hateful. He started by making her sleep in the barn, then he stopped giving her food at the dinner table. He told everyone in the village that she was cursed and that her presence was bringing bad luck to the crops. June tried everything to fix herself, but the village healer told her she was simply hollow. The day of the great trade came, a day when families swapped livestock and goods. Miller dragged June to the center of the square with a rope tied around her wrists. He announced to the neighbors that he was trading her away to anyone who would take her. He said he wanted a new wife, one who wasn't defective like June. June kept her head down, her heart breaking as her own parents turned their backs on her, ashamed of her failure to provide them with grandchildren. The crowd began to mock her, throwing old fruit and stones. They called her a waste of space and told Miller he was right to get rid of her. Just as a group of rough travelers started bidding a few silver coins for her to be their servant, a horn blasted from the hills. The Alpha King, a man named Silas who ruled the northern territories, was passing through. No one expected him to stop in a poor village like this. Silas stepped out of his carriage, wearing a cape made of midnight fur. He was a giant of a man, with a face that looked like it was carved from stone. He walked through the crowd and people scrambled to get out of his way. He stopped in front of the auction block where June stood trembling. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a strange, intense recognition. He asked Miller what the price for the woman was. Miller, thinking he could get rich, asked for 100 gold pieces. The villagers gasped, thinking the king would laugh and move on. Instead, Silas signaled his guards to bring forward a chest filled with gold bars. He told Miller that the price was too low for a woman of June's worth, but he would pay the gold just to end the transaction. He cut the rope on June's wrists with a silver dagger and told her she was no longer a slave to this village. June was terrified as Silas led her to his carriage. She thought he was taking her to a dungeon or a labor camp because she knew she was useless to a king. As the carriage pulled away, she saw Miller counting his gold with a greedy smile. She felt a deep sense of shame, wondering what Silas would do when he realized she couldn't give him the one thing every ruler wanted. She sat as far away from him as possible, staring at the floor. Silas didn't try to touch her. He told her his name and said that in his kingdom, no one is traded like an animal. He told her that he had been looking for someone with a soul as resilient as hers. He gave her a silk blanket and told her to sleep, promising that no one would ever throw a stone at her again. June didn't believe him, but for the first time in years she wasn't cold. She closed her eyes and hoped she wouldn't wake up back in the barn. The Palace of the North was a massive fortress built into a cliffside. When June arrived, she was met by a dozen servants who treated her like she was made of glass. They took her to a room with a fireplace and a bed with velvet sheets. They burned her old, tattered clothes and gave her dresses made of soft wool and gold thread. June felt like she was playing a part in a play that she didn't understand. She kept waiting for the king to demand his heir. For the first week, June only saw Silas at dinner. He sat at the head of a long table and asked her questions about her life. He didn't ask about her health or her fertility. He asked about her favorite books and the flowers she liked. June realized that Silas was lonely. His palace was beautiful but quiet, and his subjects feared him because of his power. He seemed to find peace in her company, even though she was still too scared to speak loudly. The king's advisors were not as kind as Silas. They held a secret meeting and told June that the king needed a queen who could produce a strong bloodline. They told her that if she didn't show signs of being with child within a month, they would lobby to have her sent away. They called her a temporary guest, and reminded her that she was only there because of the king's whim. June felt the old fear returning, realizing the palace was just a bigger version of the village. June decided to confront Silas. She found him in the training yard, swinging a massive sword against a wooden post. She told him that his advisors were right and that he shouldn't waste his time on her. She confessed the truth that Miller had told her every day, that she was broken and would never be a mother. She told him to send her away now before she caused him any more trouble or embarrassment in front of his court. Silas stopped his training and walked over to her, his breath coming in heavy clouds in the cold air. He told her that a woman's worth isn't measured by what her body can do, but by the strength of her heart. He told her that he had been married once before to a woman who gave him 3 sons, but she was a cruel person who didn't care about the people. He said he would rather have a kingdom with no heir than a kingdom ruled by a heartless child. June was shocked. She had never heard a man talk like that. Silas took her hand and led her to the balcony overlooking the kingdom. He told her that he wanted her to be his eyes and ears among the people. He started taking her on his rounds through the city, showing her the orphanages and the schools. June found that she had a natural talent for helping others. The people started to love her, calling her the merciful queen before she even had a crown. But a shadow was growing. Miller, June's ex-husband, had spent all the gold Silas gave him on gambling and drink. He was angry that June was living in a palace while he was back in the dirt. He went to the king's enemies in the south and told them secrets about the village's borders. He told them that the king was distracted by a worthless woman, and that now was the perfect time to attack. Miller wanted his revenge, and he didn't care how many people died to get it. The South launched a surprise raid on the border villages. News reached the palace that families were being burned out of their homes. Silas had to lead his army to the front lines to push back the invaders. Before he left, he pulled June aside and gave her a key to the secret tunnels under the palace. He told her that if the palace fell, she must run and never look back. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt more powerful than any speech. With the king gone, the advisors tried to take control. They wanted to lock June in her room, claiming it was for her safety. June refused. She remembered the people she had met in the city and knew they needed leadership. She opened the palace gates to the refugees who were fleeing the war. She organized the kitchens to feed the hungry and turned the grand ballroom into a hospital for the wounded soldiers. She was doing the work of a ruler while Silas was away. One of the wounded soldiers brought a message to June. It was a note from Miller. He had joined the Southern Army as a scout. The note said that he was coming for her and that he was going to show the world what a failed woman she really was. He threatened to kill Silas and bring June back to the village in chains to work as his servant again. June didn't cry. She felt a cold, hard anger that she had never felt before. She realized she wasn't the scared girl from the auction block anymore. The Southern Army managed to bypass Silas's main force and reached the palace walls. The advisors panicked and tried to flee through the tunnels. June stood in the courtyard and addressed the remaining palace guard. She told them that they weren't fighting for a king's gold, but for the women and children sheltering in the ballroom. Her speech was simple and honest, and it gave the guards the courage they needed to stand their ground against a much larger force. The battle for the palace was fierce. June stayed in the thick of it, not with a sword, but with bandages and water, moving between the lines to help the fallen. She saw Miller at the gates, screaming orders and looking like a madman. He managed to break through the first line of defense and spotted June. He ran at her with a heavy club, laughing that he was going to fix her once and for all. June stood her ground, refusing to run. Just as Miller swung his weapon, a massive black wolf leaped over the wall and pinned him to the ground. It was Silas. He had sensed the danger and ridden his fastest horse back to the palace, leaving the army to follow. He shifted back into his human form, his eyes glowing with rage. He didn't kill Miller immediately. He looked at June to see if she was hurt. June told him to let the law handle Miller, because Miller wasn't worth the blood on Silas's hands. The Southern army retreated when they saw their leader captured and the king returned. The palace was saved, but the cost was high. Many were wounded and the city was in disarray. Silas stood in the courtyard, covered in dust and blood, and watched June as she went back to helping the injured. He realized that June hadn't just saved the palace, she had saved the soul of his kingdom. He walked over to her and knelt in the mud, right there in front of everyone. Silas asked June to marry him for real, not as a trade or a deal, but as an equal. The people cheered, their voices echoing off the mountains. June said yes, but she made him promise one thing, that she would never be forced to be someone she wasn't. Silas promised that she was enough exactly as she was. The wedding was held a month later, and it was the biggest celebration the North had ever seen. June wore a dress of white fur and a crown of black diamonds. But the happiness was shadowed by a medical discovery. The palace physician, a wise man who had traveled the world, asked to examine June. He told her that her infertility in the village was likely caused by a slow-acting poison. He suspected that Miller had been slipping something into her tea for years to make sure she didn't get pregnant so he could eventually trade her away for a profit. The physician told her that now that she was eating clean food and was away from the village, her body was healing. June was overwhelmed by this news. It meant that she wasn't broken after all. She had been a victim of a cruel plan. She didn't tell Silas right away. She wanted to be sure. She also struggled with the idea that her value might change if she did have a child. She wanted Silas to love her for her mind and her spirit, not for her potential to provide an heir. She spent many nights walking the palace gardens, thinking about her future. Miller was sitting in the dungeon, awaiting his execution for treason. June went down to see him one last time. She didn't go to gloat, she went to ask him why. Miller admitted that he had poisoned her because he wanted the gold from the auction more than he wanted a family. He told her she was a fool for trusting a king and that Silas would eventually throw her away too. June realized that Miller's heart was the only thing in the world that was truly hollow. She told Silas about the poison and the physician's report. Silas was furious, wanting to tear the dungeon down with his bare hands. But he calmed down when June took his hand. She told him that she didn't care if she ever had a child, because she had already found her family in the people of the North. Silas told her that he felt the same way. He said that a crown is just metal, but the love they had was the real treasure. Months passed, and the kingdom flourished under their joint rule. They built schools and hospitals, and the North became a place of hope. Then, one morning, June woke up feeling a familiar sickness, but it felt different this time. It wasn't the pain of the poison. It was a strange, buzzing energy. She went to the physician, and he confirmed her suspicion. Against all odds and the cruelty of her past, she was going to have a baby. June was terrified to tell Silas. She was afraid that the focus would shift away from their work and back to the heir. She found him in the library, looking over maps of new trade routes. When she told him, Silas didn't celebrate the royal line. He cried because he was happy that June finally got to experience the one thing she thought was stolen from her. He held her and told her that whether the baby was a prince or a peasant, they would be loved for who they were. The news of the pregnancy spread, and the kingdom was overjoyed. But the South saw this as a final chance to strike. They knew that a pregnant queen was a vulnerability. They sent a group of elite assassins to infiltrate the palace during the winter festival. Their goal was to take June and use her as a hostage to force Silas to surrender his lands. The palace was filled with guests and music, making it easy for the shadows to move unseen. During the feast, the lights were suddenly extinguished. Panic broke out as the assassins struck. Silas was cut off from June by a falling portcullis. He roared in frustration as he fought through the attackers, trying to get to his wife. June was cornered in the high tower by 3 men. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the knowledge of the palace secret doors. She led the assassins on a chase through the narrow corridors she had explored during the war. She managed to trap the assassins in the old armory by locking the heavy iron doors from the outside. She used her wit and her knowledge of the building to win a battle she couldn't win with strength. When Silas finally broke through and found her, he expected to find her cowering. Instead, he found her sitting on a bench, catching her breath, with the threat neutralized. He realized then that June was the most dangerous person in the palace because she was the smartest. The assassins were dealt with, and the South finally sued for a permanent peace, realizing that the king and queen of the North were unbreakable. The winter passed, and the first flowers of spring began to bloom. June gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The advisors were disappointed it wasn't a boy, but Silas silenced them with a single look. He named the baby after June's mother, the only person from her old life who had ever shown her a shred of kindness. June stood on the balcony of the palace, holding her daughter and looking out at the kingdom. She thought about the girl who had been tied with a rope in the village square. She realized that her infertility had been her greatest curse, but it had also been the thing that led her to the only man who could see her true worth. She wasn't just a trade or a placeholder. She was the heart of the North. Silas joined her on the balcony, wrapping his arm around her waist. He looked at his daughter and then at his wife. He told June that he had a surprise for her. He had bought the old village where she grew up. He didn't burn it down. He turned it into a sanctuary for women who were being mistreated by their families. He had erased the shame of her past by turning it into a future for others. The story ends with June and Silas walking through the palace gardens as the sun sets. The black diamond crown was on her head, but she didn't need it to know she was a queen. She had gone from being traded for grain to being the mother of a new era. As the screen fades to black, she looks at the camera and smiles, a woman who is finally truly whole.